Right. All right, well, welcome everybody to the first IRES seminar of the term. My name is Hannah Whitman. I'm a professor in IRES and also cross-appointed in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems at UBC. And I have the privilege to be speaking to you from the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people where UBC is located. And then I'm also here in my house, which is the traditional territory of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people. Our seminar series here in IRES always looks at the interactions between people and nature in various ways and at various scales of engagement. We look at relations, roles, rights, responsibilities that we share with our human and non-human kin, that these relationships take place on, in, and around the land that we live on and from which we derive our survival. And our survival involves food and clean air and clean water and all the materials that we use for shelter and to have our kind of cultural aspects of our lives take place as well. So I'm super pleased to be able to introduce to you my friend and colleague Ilyas Siddique. Ilyas, I met him quite a few years ago. We were trying to figure out when that was, but it's kind of in the distant past. Ilyas is an ecologist who's worked for a long time on various aspects of forestry and agroforestry, and then increasingly agroecological transitions. Ilyas is an associate professor of agroecosystems at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, and I want to give a particular welcome to some of his students who have also been able to join us from Brazil on this Zoom talk. So that's one of the silver linings of doing our seminars this way, is we do get the ability to have people come in who aren't physically present in Vancouver. Ilyas is also a member of our Diversified Agroecosystems Research Excellence Cluster at UBC, and he's a core member of our academic advisory to the Light Farm open source farm management and data science application that we've been working on for the last several years to look at documenting agroecological transitions globally. And Ilyas will be also joining us in person in April as part of a Peter Wall visiting fellowship. So those of you who are interested can make sure to set up a coffee with him when he's back here in April. Ilyas has a PhD in ecology and environmental science. He works closely now in the areas of political economy, farm management and decision-making, and agrarian social movements. Dr. Siddique also coordinates the network of agroecological agroforestry of southern Brazil, the Rede-Safas, which is a very large network of farms across regions of the Atlantic forest that are elaborating a citizen science open database of crop management traits. And finally, Ilyas's research focuses on functional diversity and successional agroforestry, which he'll be talking about, tropical forest restoration, mechanization of syntropic agriculture, ecosystem multifunctionality, and food sovereignty, which, as many of you know, is a topic very close to my own heart. And then finally, Dr. Siddique's outreach seeks to foster the dialogue of knowledge between scientists, practitioners, and traditional ecological knowledge to catalyze the adoption and diversification of agroforestry. So thank you again, Ilyas, for sharing your work with us, and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thanks so much, Hannah, for this great opportunity. I'm really honored to be talking to you all today. So I'll share my screen. Let me just please confirm whether you can see the full screen. Can you see it?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, great. Well, as Hannah said, I will be talking today about integrating different forms of knowledge, agroforesters, practitioners' knowledge, and ecological knowledge. So different forms of knowing about the same issue, the same challenge, to cultivate biodiversity, restore biodiversity, and use it in multiple forms at the same time in the same space. So this is based on a synthesis among lots of different groups, my own lab, the Applied Ecology Lab, and the graduate programs in agroecosystems and plant genetic resources that I am part of here at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, but especially the multiple interactions with farmers and with organizations across especially the southern 3 states of Brazil, through the agroecological agroforestry network of southern Brazil, the Redes Safras, and also the Brazilian Association of Agroecology, ABA Agroecologia. Now, in these different spaces of learning, I have gathered these ideas and concepts, and we've tested it together with students, both on the university farm, the UFSC farm, here in Florianopolis in subtropical southern Brazil, but also with partners, with farmer partners in the region, to keep applying the concepts from ecology and from science to try to solve or try to bypass problems, practical problems, and vice versa, to study from a scientific perspective solutions that are being practiced by farmers across Brazil and beyond. Now, the idea is to study the natural succession of the vegetation, especially in our context, tropical and subtropical forests. But these principles that I will present here can be applied to really any kind of ecosystem, drier ecosystems or colder ecosystems. But I guess the tropics and subtropics, especially the humid tropics and subtropics, are very handy laboratories to study these processes because they occur rapidly and there's a huge pool of diversity available that can grow in under these conditions. So this is a really nice kind of field, real-life laboratory for these concepts and processes that we're studying. So the challenge is to restore biodiverse forests and produce a range of foods and medicines and fiber and timber at the same time in the same space and in a synergistic way, so that the extraction and use of products does not hamper, does not jeopardize the restoration of the ecosystem functions. So is that impossible? It sounds quite far-fetched, quite challenging, and of course there are trade-offs, inherent trade-offs between uses and restoration of ecosystem functioning and biodiversity, but there's a lot of synergies as well. So I'll explore some of those and share with you some of our experiences in how we can practically overcome the methodological, the conceptual, the practical challenges that we are faced with when we try to reconcile high biodiversity with high productivity. Now, here we see, I guess, a gradient of natural forest succession. So we're starting with relatively open ground at the far left. Can you see my arrow, my pointer?
Yeah, I can see it.
Great. So on the far left, we see the start of succession dominated by herbaceous crops, but they are already composed of a fairly high functional diversity of more light demanding crops, intermediate light demanding and shade tolerant crops, to very shade tolerant crops in the bottom, like in the understory, in the shade of the main dominant crops. Now, as we go along the natural succession, this kind of structuring, self-structuring of more light demanding and more shade tolerant plants, wild plants, occurs naturally. But it takes some time so that plants can occupy those ecological niches. Now, if we imitate and adapt this natural succession using crops, we can anticipate the arrival of some of those functional groups of plants that naturally would take a fairly long time or longer time to arrive in the adequate spaces. So in a way, we can accelerate this colonization of functional groups that can occupy most rapidly all the ecological niches, and then keep them occupied by substitution of crops of different lifespans and different adaptations. So that's, I guess, the main principle of agroforest succession that's today very widely practiced across Brazil, and is actually based on traditional systems like indigenous forms of tropical and subtropical forest management. But there's, of course, a major logistical and practical challenges in how to organize all this and how to use as little resources as possible and as little space as possible to make it viable for today's food systems. So I guess one of the key messages that I wanted you to take out of this slide is to recognize that we can occupy the different strata, the different shade tolerance conditions from the start right through to an advanced forest system. So if we apply this to manage agricultural systems, what challenges do we face? Well, first of all, a logistical challenge and a knowledge challenge, how to organize the right crops in the right space. And like this image is like a horticultural bed, taking an image from the top. So you can see here arugula rows and beetroot rows and leeks and lots of other crops here that are interspersed. It looks like a chaos, but it's actually quite organized. So here you see a continuous beetroot row and the next one, and then filled in the spaces amongst those to occupy all the niches in an efficient way. So the idea to use this is to keep this occupation of niches ongoing across succession. So here, I guess, after the harvesting of coriander, of radish, of those very short-term crops, lettuce and so on, then we're left with this next phase, still very short-term horticultural crops of like chicory and broccoli and sweet corn and so on, that then occupy more clearly the vertical stratification of niches. But so we're trying to do this kind of niche occupation not just to use space more efficiently, but also to use irrigation water more efficiently and mulch and compost and other kinds of inputs. And this high diversity can be a challenge for commercialization schemes, but at the same time, they can be mutually reinforcing with specific commercialization schemes that are increasingly popular across the globe and across Brazil and in Canada, surely too. The CSA, the community supported agriculture box schemes, where consumers expect a high diversity every week. So the consumers want to have a range of different crop types every week to be able to have a diverse and healthy diet. Now, that's the kind of practical perspective that farmers are applying across Brazil, and a very widespread, usually some called syntropic agroforestry or syntropic agriculture. Now, we've tried to test those principles in an experimental system, and within the first year of a long-term permanent plot experiment on our UFSC university farm, one of our PhD students used structural equation modeling, that is a form of path analysis that allows us to really recognize what are the drivers of changes and what are consequences, immediate and indirect consequences. And this experimental work shows that if we increase crop functional diversity we increase light interception by the crops, which increases crop productivity. But at the same time, crop functional diversity also increases crop cover, so lateral cover by crops of the agroecosystems, and by that reduces weed cover. So this negative relationship between crop cover and weed cover is changed, is manipulated in an advantageous way if we increase crop functional diversity. And that also has a secondary consequence on reducing weed functional diversity. So this statistically more robust approach to analyze several variables that are co-varying at the same time in the dynamic agroecosystem has allowed us to detect that really crop functional diversity is a key driver that we should try to optimize in designing agroecosystems. So in summary, this experimental work shows that the crop functional diversity is responsible for increasing a multifunctionality, including, in this case, crop yield, weed suppression, and soil protection, all at the same time. But here we're looking only at the very first phase of agroforest succession. That's the first year. It's the most challenging period in some ways, but also it's only a tiny fraction of what's really involved in agroforestry. And if we go back to some very already quite old work by Robert Hart and also Jack Ewell, we'll find that in many of those more common agricultural systems, traditional and widespread agricultural systems across Central America, in this case, Costa Rica, but also very widespread in other places, we usually find those intercroppings of more short-lived crops, and then only later incorporation of woody crops. And that often leads to a drop in productivity, a drop in niche occupation, which is unfortunate and maybe unnecessary. So these syntropic agroforestry systems that I'm talking about here, widely practiced among agroforest farmers in Brazil, have made very major advances in shortcutting this delay here. So to incorporate those woody plants already at the very start. So intercropping the woody crop species from cacao to coconut and so on, right at the start, together with the arugula and coriander and lettuce. But of course, to be able to do that successfully, we really need to study shade tolerance. Shade tolerance is a key limiting factor. If we don't know which crops tolerate more shade or less shade, we will inevitably jeopardize the production, the growth, the development, the health of many crops that are not shade tolerant. So shade tolerance is a trait, a plant trait that varies very dramatically across species. So I guess the most emblematic and well-known examples are like corn is very shade intolerant. It will not produce well in the shade, not even in partial shade. Eucalypts are another example. Most of the commercial eucalypts are grown in Brazil and across the world. And then on the other opposite extreme are the coffees and cocoas and so on that and black tea and those kind of crops that are very shade tolerant. So we are now applying some experimental studies to test how shade tolerant crops are, because the practical experience by farmers about shade tolerance is very relevant, but not very widely accessible to newcomers, to youngsters or to other farmers who want to start applying those principles. So if we're looking at natural succession, a natural forest tends to populate the upper stratum, the dominant, the highest layer of trees very quickly, and experiences like a self-thinning and a open space in the undergrowth. And that leads to a strong self-shading. Partly this elimination of undergrowth is due to the dense overcrowding of the upper layers. And from an agroforestry perspective, from a productivity perspective, that's not advantageous. We would really like to keep this high productivity going throughout. So what we're trying to do is to thin out the top layer and gradually increase the density of crops as we go in the profile down vertically. So if we do that management, selectively cutting and pruning agroforestry systems in that way, we get much more primary productivity out of the whole system. So that involves operational challenges like pruning the apical pruning of the top trees, but also involves some major opportunities like the quality of the bole for timber production by cutting the lateral branches and opening up the canopy to increase growth in the intermediate and lower layers. Now, if we're looking at the natural colonization, rapid growth, and then stagnation phase that's quite common across plants, we find that over time we experience a rapid development of the crops, each one according to their own inherent growth rate, but then a stagnation and a drop, sometimes a drop in biomass because there's senescence and so on. So overall, we find periods of stagnation that in a whole agroforestry successional context leads to drops in productivity. So we really want to bypass, we want to shortcut these periods of low productivity. So if we manage to selectively cut, we can increase productivity tremendously. That's been demonstrated on a practical level, and we're increasingly observing that also on an experimental level. So what we're really wanting to do is not just to increase productivity from a use perspective like food production, timber, and so on, but also we want to accelerate the restoration of ecosystem functions. So part of this selective cutting, both pruning, coppicing, and selective removal of plants before they get to the stagnating phase, produces a lot of biomass that we can add to the soil. So in that way, we can accelerate the production of litter, bark structures, and fallen timber in such a way that we can also accelerate the colonization and biomass accrual of soil microorganisms and soil invertebrates. So the key elements or the key processes of soil restoration can be accelerated by this management. So it's a bifunctional process, I guess, the selective cutting of biomass. We are increasing productivity from an economic perspective, but we are also accelerating restoration of ecosystem functions. But of course, the key challenge here is labor. So that's so much work that in many cases that's just inviable, non-viable. So in that respect, many farmers have sought and are seeking to develop systems of mechanization and other forms of labor saving that can help to accelerate especially the heavy and repetitive tasks like slashing, chopping, and transferring biomass, to free up labor to fine-tune the manual tasks like pruning, harvesting, and planting. So I'll jump over some of those details. We're studying in experimental systems forms of functional groups that we can recognize and more easily communicate with farmers, and to understand from farmers' knowledge their experiences, to be able to define and elaborate guidelines, technical guidelines that people who are starting to cultivate like these more diversified agroforestry systems can actually get on board and get some start. So one of the key challenges with mechanization is when we cut with a mechanized systems, various well-established machines and implements cut the biomass at the ground level. So we're really looking at the need for crops that can be wild species, but adapted in a cultivated context, like green manure crops that are planted in a way to produce maximum biomass, and then are cut in an early stage at the ground level and then resprout. So we are really looking at a functional trait here that's unfortunately not so widely been studied in ecology. Other functional traits have been very widely studied in ecology, but those more practical traits that are really missing, and that's what we're trying to facilitate, I guess, the communication between practical practitioners' knowledge and science ecology especially. So what we're looking at here is we are imposing a disturbance regime by those selective cuttings. I'm sorry, in this case, actually, it's cutting of everything at the ground level. So we are really reducing functional richness. We're only letting certain types of plants establish and re-establish under this disturbance regime. So we are studying now how to combine different crop traits and crop functional groups that can persist under those drastic cutting regimes. And that way we can optimize the biomass production without having to replant every time. So we are focusing on perennial crops that can resprout under those disturbance regimes. So we're applying the same idea of functional diversity, but within the functional richness that's permitted by the cutting at the ground level, this drastic disturbance regime. Now, as I was saying before, we are interested in eliminating those periods of stagnation. So we are wanting to cut the plants before they stagnate in their growth. That way, we free up time and in ecological niche space to occupy with other crops. So that way, we increase overall productivity, but then have to study which crops would really be able to combine, to complement one another. So we're looking at erect crops, tussock-forming crops, shrub crops, and prostrate growing crops, and climbing crops. All of these growth forms we are looking to combine in the same space so that they can occupy most rapidly the niches that are available, and then reoccupy after each cutting. So this combination of drastic disturbance regimes with reoccupation of high functional diversity is a challenge, but also there's major advances to be had here in terms of productivity of biomass that can be used for green manure, and therefore substitute external inputs and increase the health of the whole ecosystem. So I'll just jump over that for the lack of time. What is, of course, a challenge is how these machines can be made available to farmers who are not capitalized, who don't have access to financial resources to buy machinery. So the landless movement in Brazil has made major advances in organizing their grassroots to acquire machines and then use them in a collective way. So a family farmer, small-scale farmer, doesn't need to have a whole range of machines for him or herself. Really, what's the challenge is to organize the community, in cooperatives or social movements in a way that these machinery can be shared and can be adequately allocated among users and at the same time reduce costs and reduce impacts. Now, there's several materials available, unfortunately only in Portuguese, but very inspiring in how the social organization has made it viable to use machinery. But a key other issue that I wanted to address here is we're not only wanting to produce horticultural crops and timber and so on. We also want to conserve biodiversity that has difficulties in re-establishing, like threatened species. And a very widespread practice among agroforest farmers across Brazil is to directly seed a mixture of different species in the same planting holes as they plant pioneer seedlings. So in that way, those seedlings provide shade, initial shade necessary for those late successional, shade tolerant and slow growing species that are the most commonly threatened species. And many of those threatened species are also very useful potentially economically. So like Jussara is the Atlantic forest acai, a very nutritious, a very full of antioxidants and so on, major contribution to public health if more accessible to the population. And Cambucá is another, is a Myrtaceae species, also vulnerable in terms of threats to extinction, and very useful, very nutritious fruit species that are here were directly seeded in the planting hole and then are facilitated. We've shown that experimentally facilitated by those pioneer species planted as seedlings. And in some collaborative work in Mexico with the National Autonomous University of Mexico, what we found is that much of the biodiversity that's potentially useful is the plant biodiversity in this case is actually not used. So here we're looking at the number of uses of species in black across the full range of woody species occurring in secondary forests in the Pacific coast of Mexico. Only those green ones here are actually used locally. So there's not just in the Pacific coast of Mexico, but across the world, really, there is underutilization of potential socioeconomic uses of biodiversity. So if we could more fully utilize biodiversity, we could make it also economically more viable, this kind of management of agroforest succession. Now, in this case, we're actually looking at, we're also looking at how these uses or these potential uses actually interact with the restoration of ecological functions. And we detected some major synergies, both in terms of soil and water conservation, soil decompaction, and forest biomass, as well as the versatility and productivity of potentially useful plant products. So what we really should explore more of those synergies, and biodiversity really is a key driver in this. But there's also, of course, challenges with the production and commercialization chains. Like there's major advances being made, for example, with this Jussara, the Atlantic forest acai, and also ginger or turmeric and so on, that are very typical and very adapted, shade-adapted agroforestry species. But then there's major challenges with using wood, processing wood, and from the agroforestry context. Now, in this context, the Rede Safas, the agroecological agroforestry network of southern Brazil, has highlighted very strongly that there's a challenge to create mechanisms for knowledge exchange, both among farmers, so peer-to-peer kind of exchange, that's already happening in farmer to farmer kind of learning spaces, but many of those spaces are not accessible widely. So there's a major challenge for people who want to agroforest their degraded ecosystems, need to don't have easy access to those learning spaces. And so from that arose the idea of a citizen science database where practitioners can record, can add their practical management trait data, and from a design perspective, make that interoperable, like with APIs, to draw on external databases like crop use databases across the globe, and other ecological trait databases that can be useful also to help create an interface, interactive interface to select, combine, filter species for each particular context. So, and we are looking to create connections with Lightfarm, an amazing app that's developed at UBC, led by Hannah, and we're looking at ways to make those different tools, decision tools, and analytical tools integrated in as much as possible, so that they can feed back one another in a synergistic way. So for knowledge sharing and for catalyzing the agroecological transition by diversifying multifunctional production to restore biodiversity and use it at the same time. So I would really like to stress that these ideas that I presented here are based very much on a collective learning, and here I'll just give my special thanks to several people who have contributed to this collective learning experience. Thanks so much for your attention, and let's discuss.
Thanks, Ilyas. That was wonderful, and such good and fun images of all those agroforestry systems. So we'll start, we normally start with 2 questions from students. So feel free to raise your hands, folks, and I'll call on you. Let's see. Pascual.
Oh, okay, thank you. It's very interesting and I can relate. So my question is, what can you advise to countries? It's not Brazil, I came from the Philippines, and our country is frequently visited by hurricanes. And this affected very much the farmers. It's very hard to recover. So I'm listening to you. I'm wondering if you had a study that you factor risk like these hurricanes or pests or sort of like that problem. But the number one is the weather condition, especially the hurricanes.
Sure. Do you want me to interact directly, or do you pool questions?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and answer that one while we wait for other folks to gather their thoughts.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Pascual, for your very important point. I guess one of the key issues with diversification also is gaining resilience. So if you are experiencing a hurricane or other kind of dramatic disturbance that kills off some of your crops, at least some others will resist, will partly be protected by the overstory crops, and also partly be more, just by chance, be more adapted or more resistant to those disturbance regimes. So for example, with a stronger shoot system that can resist breakage or more resprouting capacity, once the major branches are broken off, they can resprout then after the hurricane hit. So that's actually something that's already been quite widely studied and shown, that agroecological systems, and especially agroforestry systems, particularly the more diversified systems, are much more resilient because of those two main mechanisms: the likelihood of including resistant species to those disturbances, and also the protection, the facilitative effect of some of the structure protecting the rest of it.
Great. So let's
Okay,
hear.
thank you.
Yeah, let's hear from Susanna. Maybe Susanna and Mari, you can both give your questions, and then he can answer those two together.
Sure. Hi there. Thanks so much, Ilyas, for that talk. It was really ecologically fascinating. And then I also really appreciated how it illuminates the skill and the detail required for a lot of these agroecological farming methods. I was wondering if you might be able to say a bit more about some of the labor-saving technologies that you mentioned, maybe given it a few really promising or exciting examples. And I'm also wondering if you could say something about who is involved in developing those technologies. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, maybe start with the last one, who's involved in developing. Well, it's really a collective learning process where farmers, especially agroforest farmers, try different things, try different solutions, and then they gain prominence as others experience the success, and then they get transmitted through peer-to-peer kind of farmer-to-farmer learning spaces. But then, as I said, this is really not accessible to everyone. So there's a huge challenge in making this knowledge widely available. So communication is really a huge challenge, maybe even more so than the actual technical issues. And so about the labor-saving solutions, well, mechanization is, I guess, one of the key ones that we're studying. So we're studying machines and tools that can operationalize the same kind of management operation repeatedly and more rapidly with less effort, physical effort, and also with less time. So I guess this is somewhat a departure from traditional systems that are much more complex and less structured in a spatio-temporal way. So what we see with a lot of those syntropic agroforestry systems is that they are highly organized. They're high diversity, but very much structured in functional spaces. So for example, if you take this, oh, actually you can't see my screen anymore. We'll just jump back on that. So if you take this example again here, where you have one row, we're looking here from the side. So this is lots of trees growing in a row behind one another. This space here really needs to be managed in a manual way, because we are looking here at lots of different species that need to be pruned at different moments, different points in time, and with different ways, pruning in a V kind of shape to stimulate and facilitate fruit production and harvesting, versus more bold development of timber species that are pruned laterally and driven up. So these kind of management interventions need to be manual, or need to be at least at most semi-mechanized. But then those other spaces where you have green manure crops, where you basically produce biomass that can then be used as mulch and as green manure sources to suppress weeds and fertilize and stimulate the biota in the soil, these can be very strongly mechanized. Like much of those very heavy operations can be mechanized, and of course they restrict by diversity possible. Like as I was saying before, in ecology that would be called the reduced functional richness. So not all functional groups are able to persist in this space. So most tree species, for example, wouldn't be able to grow under this disturbance regime here. But that's not necessary either, because we can concentrate those biodiversity elements that are intolerant to the disturbance regime of tractors or mowers or so on. We can restrict those to spaces where those machines do not enter. So we are basically structuring the high diversity systems in a spatial way so that we have high disturbance spaces and low disturbance spaces, and high mechanized spaces and manually managed spaces. Does that answer your question, Suzanne?
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ilyas. So Mari's up next, and then Claire.
Hey, Ilyas, thanks as always. You always have so much to contribute and say, and I find it fascinating. And I was really quickly just curious, when you were talking about all these different kind of horticultural plants that you use, have you guys identified, like the triangle that you were kind of showing, the mix of all these different species? Are there specific plants or crops that you've found like these ones work especially well with these ones? For example, like the kambuka or the tucata, like do they flourish or do better when they're mixed with very particular things? Have you guys been able to find that out, or are you still kind of experimenting with what types of crops you sort of intermix and use?
Yeah, great question. Well, actually, those pairs or triangular kind of combinations of species for intercropping has been a very widely used approach. And on Wikipedia, you see these huge tables of companion species and so on. But really, what we want to do is go beyond those combinations, because we really want to get to the crux of the mechanisms of why different species complement one another. And so for that, we're looking at the functional traits. So the key axes or the key gradients of functional traits that we're looking at here is longevity, how long a crop stays in the cultivated space until it is removed, harvested, for example. So this longevity, the productive longevity, is one key, maybe the most important functional traits along which we can organize complementary combinations. The second one is shade tolerance. So here they are frequently called strata, like as you increase the stratum, the species are less shade tolerant. So the emergent crops do not tolerate any shade. But then other traits are also important, like the resprouting capacity. So if you cut a plant at the base level, probably most species of plants will not persist, they will die. But there is a very significant subset of species, useful species, both for biomass and green manure production, and also for actual crop food production, timber production, and so on, are very tolerant of coppicing or cutting at the base, and then resprout with force. So this resprouting capacity is a major third element of functional trait that we should consider to decide which species to combine, because that will allow us to go beyond the kind of recipes of these three crops will grow back well together. We really want to have a more flexible, more adaptable kind of principle-based system of intercropping, not just a recipe-based system of intercropping. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Great, so we have Claire up next.
Thank you so much, Ilyas. It's always wonderful to see how this work is progressing, and also to hear your perspectives on, explicitly using functional complementarity to build agroecological mixes and diversified mixes that are productive and kind of closed loop sustainable. It's wonderful. My question is about, well, as you were talking about the pruning and getting a lot of material back into the soil, and the sort of the regenerative capacity of doing that, I was thinking about really degraded farmlands that may have experienced a huge amount of industrial production and sort of soil mining, et cetera. And I'm wondering if that's explicitly part of what you're thinking about and or doing? I mean, I don't know what the starting point was for where you work. Are you working on soils that were really terrible that you had to restore, or yeah, or they sort of more sort of intermediate and it's more of a transformation of the farming system, or maybe it's all of the above? Curious about that, and just what you think about the potential to like bring back really degraded lands.
Of course, really maybe the most important kind of challenge to focus this production and restoration efforts on the most degraded areas that are not regenerating at sufficient rates naturally. So let where the forest can regrow naturally, let it regrow, let it undergo passive restoration, but let's focus our efforts on restoring the really most degraded spaces. So I totally agree with this, the importance of this approach. Now, I guess I would try to differentiate the limiting factors. I wouldn't only look at it as one gradient, very much degraded to little degraded or not degraded, but rather what are the ecological limiting factors? Like, for example, we are at the Ufsk University Farm, we are looking at a space that like a soil that is subjected to frequent waterlogging. So the lack of aeration in the soil is a major limiting factor. And that's not a consequence of degradation. Like it's the natural condition, the topographic position basically of that land. But at the same time, it's a huge filter. It's an environmental filter that excludes lots of species from the space. So for example, avocado or papaya or these sort of crops, we don't, or even beans like the common bean, all of these suffer quite a lot from the waterlogging conditions. So we kind of filter those out. But we have also worked in other spaces that are not waterlogged, but subject to other kinds of poverties or like ecological constraints, like soil compaction, very dramatic soil compaction, or lack of organic matter, which are often also, of course, interlinked. So depending on what are the most stringent or most challenging environmental filters, we try to filter the initial suit of crops, the initial initial breadth of crops to suit those conditions. So in the university farm space, we are looking at the crops and wild species that are more tolerant to waterlogging. But in the hillsides that are more compacted or really have lost their clay components because of erosion, or have lost their biological inoculum, like the microbes and the invertebrates are gone, or most of them are gone, so that the biological restoration and biological fertility is really hampered by this lack of inoculum of organisms. There we're trying to really focus on biomass production. So even if it's not like plant biomass production, even if it's not really in the very first stage able to yield major food stuffs, but sometimes we need to go through some agroforest cycle just for soil recovery. Now, of course, there is also species that are more capable of deep rooting, of breaking through compact layers. So using these as, I guess, multiple filters, environmental filters that allows us to choose a subset of species that are more likely to thrive under those conditions. And in many cases, there's underutilized, like economically underutilized potential of those wild species that are more hardy. So in Brazil, we are also experiencing a kind of a cultural movement of underutilized food species that what are called punks, like underutilized food species, that is like an acronym in Portuguese, which refers to you know, the underutilized potential of those food species. So wild species that where in the local culture are not, there's no habit to use them for food, but can be very useful for soil restoration. And so, for example, pigeon pea, like the second most important pulse in India, in Brazil is virtually only used as green manure crop. So most cultures in Brazil just ignore the food potential, even though it's like potentially very nutritious, the pigeon pea, and extremely hardy. So overcoming those cultural barriers and cultural bottlenecks can also be a major leap to overcoming those ecological challenges by selecting very hardy crops that can be used in other ways. And of course, that depends on cultural sharing of recipes. So, for example, the pigeon peas, like some students of ours have teamed up with some urban collectives that are donating food during this pandemic to people, hungry people in the city, and they have prepared falafels based on pigeon pea pulses. So this is a very cheap way of producing a very high quality, high nutritionally attractive kind of food, and a protein source that is made of crops that are extremely rustic, extremely adapted to low fertility conditions and strong environmental filters, even drought tolerant and so on. Like pigeon pea is a really amazing crop.
So,
Thank you.
Ilyas, we just have about 1 minute left, so maybe I'll ask the last question, and it's kind of a wrap-up question. So thank you, first of all, for this really informative and exciting presentation. And I guess my question is, you know, knowing what we know about the benefits of agroforestry, you know, ecologically and nutritionally, what do you see as the biggest barrier for more farmers adopting agroforestry practices on their farms?
Yeah, that's actually one of the questions that has been addressed collectively by the Regis Safas a couple of years back, and people weren't able to really pin it down to a single one. So one common limiting factor is labor, to find ways to more efficiently use labor. A second one is knowledge, to really popularize and facilitate access to those crop traits, but also management systems that can facilitate those productive systems, and also commercialization methods like processing of those crops. So access to knowledge and sharing of knowledge is a second key limiting factor. A third one is commercialization chains, like direct links between producers and consumers to bypass the big retail giants that really monopolize or concentrate the profit and then take it out from both farmers and consumers. And the fourth one is legal challenges that have been identified. So in Brazil and across the world, the legal mindset is still very much based on land sparing kind of mindset. So you have to conserve in one space, and you're not able to interfere. You're not able to extract any of those protected areas. And in other areas, you use agrochemicals as much as your vendors sell you, and no restrictions or virtually no restrictions on degradation. And so this kind of mindset is really jeopardizing a lot of progress in agroforestry, in agroecology. So, for example, the Brazilian legislation and the other legislations in other countries punish agroforestry farmers for selectively cutting native species, even though there might be very widespread, there may be very common native pioneer species that are being punished, being fined for doing selective cutting, while at the same time they're restoring, they're planting, they're producing seedlings in the nursery and then planting out highly threatened species in the same space. But this is being ignored by the fiscal, the compliance, environmental compliance authorities when they fine farmers. So this kind of mindset of land sparing is really jeopardizing a kind of integrated conservation through sustainable use, both of biodiversity and of the entire ecosystem. So these 4 factors, I guess, have been identified as key limiting factors to adopting more massively agroforestry. And I might cite the agroecological massification research group in Ecosur in the south of Mexico, who have studied these processes of massification and the challenges, the barriers to massification of agroecology quite a lot. So this is a very inspiring source of understanding for us too.
Great. Well, that was just a wonderful summary, and noting that all 4 of those are social rather than technical problems, just I think emphasizes the challenges that we have and the importance of doing this kind of really integrated social and ecological research that you're doing. So I want to thank you again. We're just at our time. So I encourage those of you in the audience to reach out to Ilyas if you'd like to know more. He has some great papers that are available. And he will be back with us again in April. All fingers crossed. So thank you again, Ilyas.
Thanks so much for having me. Speak to you soon.
Yeah.